In contrast to seedless vascular plants with seeds have heterospory. Hetero meaning different. So naturally, these plants produce two types of spores. The megaspore, which forms the female gametophyte that eventually produces eggs, and a microspore, which forms the male gametophyte, which eventually forms the sperm. Notice how these plants begin to differentiate between the sexes at the sporophyte phase. Vascular seed plants obviously produce seeds. This is the reproductive part of the plant that contains a plant embryo and stored food. The advantage of having seeds is that vascular plants no longer are dependent on water for fertilization. These plants will also produce pollen. This pollen can be transported via wind or animals. Vascular seed plants are split into two groups, gymnosperms and angiosperms.
The word gymnosperm means naked seed. This group of plants produce seeds that are on the surface of modified leaves. In most cases, these seeds are in the form of scales on a cone. They also do not produce any fruit, which is what normally encloses the seeds of a plant. Gymnosperms also lack flowers, so they depend on wind to deliver the microgametophyte, the male gamete, to the ovule. This group of plants is split into four phyla. That's Ginkgophyta, Psychotophyta, Genophyta, and Coniferophyta.
So the way I like to remember this group is by remembering my favorite drink from Tim Hortons, a double-double. This group has two phyla that begin with a G and two that begin with a C. So here's your double-double for the day, double G and double C. And here's mine.
Angiosperms is the youngest group of plants on Earth. Yet, when we talk about plants, you are most likely thinking of this group. It is the group that is defined by the presence of a flower, which contains all the reproductive structures of a plant. Angiosperms produce fruit, which encloses the seeds. This is how this group got their name, because angiosperm literally means closed seed.
A typical flower has the male and female parts within the same sporophyte. The male parts is the anther and the filament. Together, we call it the stamens. The anther is where the microsporangia produces pollen. Pollen is the male gamete in angiosperms. The female parts consist of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Together, we call this the pistil. The stigma is the part that receives the pollen, which then grows a pollen tube through the style and enters into the ovary. Inside the ovary, there are many ovules, and each ovule has a megaspore. The pretty part of the flower is the petals. Collectively, we call this the corolla. Green leafy structures right beneath the petals are called the sepals, and collectively, these are called the calyx. Just a reminder, angiosperms are heterosporous, so they have a microspore, which is the male spore, and a megaspore, which is the female spore. A single pollen grain has two sperm nuclei, while the megagametophyte is within the ovules, and that is within the ovary. Inside the megagametophyte is an egg and two polar bodies. When pollen lands on the stigma, the pollen grains start to germinate. A tube cell in the pollen grain begins to grow a long pollen tube down the style and into the ovary. It then enters the ovule. This is to allow the two sperm nuclei inside the pollen grain to travel down the tube and enter the ovule. One sperm nucleus will fertilize the egg to form a diploid zygote, while the other sperm nucleus will fertilize the two polar bodies and form the endosperm. This process is called double fertilization. The endosperm is what feeds the embryo as it develops. As the fruit develops, the ovules eventually become the seeds, and the ovary is now the fruit. Think about that the next time you take a bite of an apple.
So, here's your land plants 101. The first question we have to ask is there vascular tissue? If there is no vascular tissue, we go to our non-vascular plants, which were the bryophytes and hepatophytes you saw in lab. But if there is vascular tissue, we go to our vascular land plants. Now, as mentioned in the videos, there's two ways this can go. The first way is if you have spores. Then we look at the seedless vascular plants. The example are the lycophytes and the pterophytes. In the case where we have vascular plants with seeds, we go to our vascular seed plants. From here, we ask the question, do they have flowers? If there are no flowers, we go to the gymnosperms. This is where you look at the ginkgophyta, psychotophyta, genophyta, and coniferophyta. Just like you remember that double, double G, double C. If there are flowers, so yes, we go to the angiosperms. The example is the anthophyta. The anthophyta can be split into two groups. That's the dicots and monocots. So there's your land plants 101.
So the way I like to remember this phyla is by remembering my favorite drink from Tim Hortons, a double-double. This group has two